Good evening and welcome. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Port Huron Statement, the manifesto of the student activist movement, Students for a Democratic Society. The document was drafted by Tom Hayden, an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and launched a decade of student protest and mass action for a more democratic society. We're thrilled to have the Tom Hayden here to discuss the statement and its relevance in today's student-led democracy movements around the world. To introduce Mr. Hayden, we are delighted to have with us Noam Chomsky. Following
Come right up.
Following our speakers' remarks, we will open the floor for Q&A. Please line up behind the mics in the aisle to ask your questions. And we also have several of Tom Hayden's books available over here on the stage that he will sign and sell at the end of the event. Before we get started, I wanted to thank the co-sponsors, Boston Review, MIT Department of Political Science, and the Center for International Studies at MIT. Please visit Boston Review's website at bostonreview.net for supplemental material on Port Huron, including an essay by Mr. Hayden. In addition, I'd like to announce a couple of events that you may find interesting, including this Friday when we will look at the Arab Spring and its impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And on May 7th, James Galbraith will be here for a book talk on inequality and instability. He will discuss the state of the world economy leading up to the Great Crisis. Now, please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky.
Thanks. Someday I'll learn which side of the street Wong Auditorium is on, and I'll get somewhere on time, but not yet, only 57 years. When Tom's Port Huron statement was released in mid-1962, it wasn't just a breath of fresh air. It was more like a blast of fresh air. It quickly played a major role in galvanizing the student movements that were beginning to poke their heads through the sound here and there around the country. One of the major ones was a couple of years before in Greensboro, North Carolina, when black students sat in on lunch counters, promptly arrested, kept coming back. That set off the freedom rides, which Tom was very much involved in, formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SDS, a number of others, a little bit later the Berkeley Free Speech Movement. And the Port Huron Statement was more or less the unifying document that very eloquently captured the goals, the hopes, the sometimes illusions, the expectations of the student movement, which over the decade simply civilized the country in a remarkable fashion before it self-destructed at the end of the decade in ways that also carry some lessons. Actually, MIT wasn't involved at the beginning. This was a very quiet, apathetic campus. There was a lot of faculty activity, but almost no student activity. That changed. By the latter part of the decade, MIT became one of the most activist campuses in the country. This is due to the remarkable work of a small group of undergraduates, many of them still involved in very significant activity. That had a lasting effect on the Institute, and I think a very welcome one. Well, before Tom talks, let me say a couple of words about what the world looked like in 1962. That's well to keep in mind. 1962 happens to be a very significant year in world affairs. In fact, a couple of months after the Port Huron statement was released, October 1962, came what has been properly called the most dangerous moment in human history. That's the phrase of historian Arthur Schlesinger, who was close confidant of President Kennedy's and official memoirist of the Kennedy administration. He's referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 62. During that crisis, there were two occasions on which the world came very close to what would a nuclear war, which in President Eisenhower's words would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, barely escaped. Plenty of recurrences since, and some are possibly imminent today, hasn't ended. There's a background. Next October, I'm sure the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis will be commemorated. It'll be interesting to see how much of the background is presented. So the immediate background was a major campaign of terror launched against Cuba by the Kennedy administration. Its centerpiece was Operation Mongoose, run by Edward Lansdale, who had plenty of experience in terrorism, sometimes called counter-terror. If you look closely, they're approximately identical. Even the descriptions in Army manuals are almost identical. This was the top priority. The top priority of the Kennedy administration was to overthrow the Castro regime. No effort was to be spared in doing so. I'm virtually quoting Robert Kennedy, who was the president's brother, who was put in charge of the campaign. It was a major campaign of terror. I won't run through the details, you can find them. But what was critical, and of course the terror went on long, it was picked up again right after the crisis and went on, in fact, in many ways up to the present. Kennedy's role, Robert Kennedy's role, according to Schlesinger in his biography, was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. Again, top priority of the government. It came very close to nuclear war, barely avoided it. Shortly after, in 1963, Edward Lansdale was given the Distinguished Service Medal for his achievements in terrorizing Cuba and bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. You look back further, there were reasons for this. Partly the reason was the almost hysterical reaction to the failure in Washington, to the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And but a deeper reason was that Cuba was in fact a major threat to the United States. And it was explained by Arthur Schlesinger, who was Kennedy's main Latin American advisor. He summarized the reports of a Latin American mission to the incoming president. He said, the danger is the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, which might have considerable appeal to others in the region who are suffering from the same kind of repression and violence and starvation that the people of Cuba were suffering on the US-backed dictatorship. As was put in internal documents at the time, a fundamental problem is Cuba's successful defiance of US policies going back 150 years, that is, to the Monroe Doctrine, which announced the US plan to dominate the hemisphere. Couldn't be implemented at the time. The British were too strong, but it was recognized that over time British power would decline, US power would increase, and the US would achieve what the founding fathers took as their major foreign policy goal, to take over Cuba. Now, that happened in 1898. Here it's called the liberation of Cuba. In fact, it was the prevention of Cuba's liberation from Spain, which they had practically achieved. And it remained a virtual colony until actual liberation in January '59. And the U.S. Reaction began very quickly, bombing. A couple of months later, formal decision by the Eisenhower administration to overthrow the regime, secret at that time. In March 1960, Kennedy administration took over. It was escalated it sharply up to the level of virtual nuclear war. The Lansdale mission was designed so that in October 1962, it would lead to uprising and subversion, which would be able to overthrow the government along with direct U.S. Military intervention. October 62, most dangerous moment in human history. Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense at the time, conceded later that if he was a Cuban, he would have expected invasion given what was happening. Well, that's Cuba. Cuba was what was called, it's called in internal documents, a virus that might spread contagion to others. The virus is the spread of the idea of taking matters into your own hands. Contagion is that others may be infected by it. That terminology is borrowed from a gentleman who's speaking down the street at the moment, Henry Kissinger, when he was actually referring to the Allende regime, which he and his boss, Richard Nixon, were about to overthrow on what's called in Latin America the first 9/11, 1973, by any rational measure, much worse than the second 9/11, what we call 9/11, but out of history, like everything that's not supposed to belong there. Well, that's, what do you do when you have a virus that's going to spread contagion? Well, you destroy the virus and you inoculate the potential victims. And that's exactly what was done. They didn't quite succeed in destroying Cuba, but have kept it in a stranglehold ever since, with years of terror, with a crushing embargo, which is opposed by the entire world. The UN can only round up Israel and Marshall Islands or somebody. But it continues, and there's a really important point. You cannot permit successful defiance. That's what I've sometimes called the Mafia Principle, one of the leading principles of world affairs all over the place. And it's understandable. If you're the godfather and you own your territory for the US, the world, and some small storekeeper somewhere that doesn't pay protection money, which you don't care about, I mean, you don't even notice the money, but you can't let them get away with it. That kind of successful defiance is quite dangerous, might spread contagion, others could get the idea, you'd be in real trouble. So you don't just send your goons in to get the money, you get them in to beat them to a pulp and make an example. So leading theme of world affairs, you find it over and over again. One place you find it is another event that took place in 1962, which we are not commemorating now, which tells you a lot about the mood of the country. In 1962, Kennedy launched the direct invasion of South Vietnam. That led pretty soon to the worst atrocity in the post-World War II period. Millions of people killed in Vietnam, many millions elsewhere, 4 countries destroyed. Kennedy in November 1961, early 62, sent the US Air Force to start bombing South Vietnamese targets, authorized napalm, crucially authorized chemical warfare for defoliation and crop destruction, began the programs that drove ultimately millions of peasants into what amounted to concentration camps or urban slums so that they could be protected against the insurgents who the government knew very well that they were supporting. The chemical warfare has had particularly lethal effects up to the present. Saigon hospitals are full of aborted fetuses, severely deformed babies. The main component of the chemical warfare was dioxin, which is severe poison, carcinogen, also has genetic effects. This is third generation, still showing up. The first book on the effects of Agent Orange, as it was called, on the South Vietnamese has just appeared by Fred Wilcox, a study of the victims, his first one, and it's not going to be a bestseller given the kind of society we live in and the kind of culture we're part of. It should be. Of course, there's no compensation for the victims. There is a debate about Vietnam, the Vietnam War. There's a debate between what are called the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks say, if we'd fought harder, we could have won. The Doves say it was a lost cause, it wasn't worth it. It's approximately the same debate that took place in the Soviet Union right before it collapsed about Afghanistan, or for that matter, on the German general staff after Stalingrad. Was the two-front war a mistake, or could we have made it somehow? Interestingly, the dovish side is expressed pretty well by President Carter. 1977, he was asked, do we owe some compensation to the Vietnamese? And he said, we owe them no debt because the destruction was mutual. No comment. Take a look. Interestingly, the population felt differently. At that time, around 70% of the population described the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake, a view that you simply could not find anywhere in articulate opinion. You can take a look and check. Well, that's the Indochina War. A third, incidentally, the reason for the Indochina War was very similar to the attack on Cuba. If you look back at internal records, we're lucky to be in a very free country. There's tremendous access to internal documents, declassified documents. It was the same concern back in the early 50s. The US didn't care that much about Indochina, but it was regarded as a virus that might spread contagion. Independent nationalism in Vietnam particularly might infect other countries in the region, maybe going as far as Indonesia, which did matter, that had rich resources. And that might go all the way to Japan, which Asia historian John Dower, who's here, one of the leading Asia historians, described as the super domino. If Indonesia fell to independence, Japan might decide to accommodate to an independent Southeast Asia, becoming its commercial and industrial center in a region separated from US control. That would have meant that the United States would have lost the Pacific phase of World War II, which was fought to prevent that outcome. That was Japan's new order. And in the early 1950s, US planners were not prepared to contemplate losing World War II. So destroy the virus, in this case the virus was pretty well destroyed, and establish brutal military dictatorships everywhere in the region. Thailand, Burma, and Philippines, and crucially Indonesia. And once that was done, the virus was contained. In fact, McGeorge Bundy, the Harvard dean, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in later years, in retrospect, he concluded that the US should have called off the war in 1965 when a military coup took place in Indonesia, killed hundreds of thousands of people, secured the country, opened it up to Western exploitation, no more contagion. They didn't think about it at the time. Well, that's Vietnam. The same was done with Cuba. Cuba was severely attacked, and a plague of repression spread through the region like nothing in the history of Latin America. It began with a major military coup in 1964 in Brazil, actually planned by the Kennedy administration, though implemented right after the assassination. Brazil's an important country. That was the first of the sort of neo-Nazi style national security states, and then it spread over the hemisphere. Pinochet in Chile was one of them. Argentina was the worst. That was Reagan's favorite. Spread to Central America in the 1980s with atrocities you know about. Well, that's how, in both of those cases, the problem of the virus and contagion was dealt with. There was a contributing factor in Latin America, another critically important event that took place also in October 1962. That's Vatican II, Second Vatican Council, which was initiated by Pope John Paul XXIII, which, well, in the words of one of the leading historians of Christianity, Hans Kung, was an epoch-making and irreversible event. Irreversible, I'm not so sure, but epoch-making, definitely. It was the first time in 1,600 years that the Church returned to the Gospels. The message of Vatican II was that the Church should adopt the radical pacifist message of the Gospels, which is there if anybody bothers to read it, not just mouth the words, and adopt what was called the preferential option for the poor. And it was particularly influential in Latin America. Priests, this is 1962, priests, same time as the missile crisis, same month in fact, priests, nuns, lay people went out to the peasantry, organized people in what were called base communities, read the Gospels, thought about it, asked how they could deal with the problems of their own lives, take power into their own hands. The U.S. wasn't having any of that, as you can imagine, nor was the Vatican, incidentally, after Pope John XXIII died. That's another factor that set off this massive wave of repression. That one came to an end in there are plenty of religious martyrs, Archbishop of El Salvador, priests, nuns, long list of them. It ended in 1989, right at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, had their brains blown out at the Jesuit University in El Salvador. The action was carried out by an elite Salvadoran battalion, armed and trained by the United States, a long train of bloody victims in its wake. It had just returned from some training, updating of their skills at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And we know that it was acting on the direct orders of the High Command. That was leaked in Spain about 2 years ago, and the document was actually published in the newspapers. I don't think it's ever been mentioned in the United States. The High Command, of course, had very close contact with the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. military. And that essentially terminated it, and more or less, not quite, there's more that goes on. And there's no real question about who was responsible for all of this, because the perpetrators have identified themselves. The School of the Americas, which trains Latin American officers, has a horrible record. If you take a look at its what they call their talking points, the points by which they advertise themselves, one of them is that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology, the heresy that was set in motion by Vatican II. So that was an extra reason to go after the virus and block the spread of contagion. Well, that's the world not a bad picture of the world in 1962, along with the fact that nobody paid any attention to any of this. And in fact, we're not commemorating the 50th anniversary of the worst atrocity of the post-World War II period, because almost nobody knew about it. Kennedy's invasion of South Vietnam. It's not that information wasn't there. Like if you read the back pages of the New York Times, you could find a little item saying that a third of the bombing missions are being carried out by the U.S. Air Force and a couple of other things like that. So it was there, but kind of like a yawn. Who cared? Well, the effect of the 60s was to change a lot of this. but not to change it enough. There have been major changes. In fact, the fact that we're meeting here is a perfectly good illustration of that. In 1962 at MIT, you couldn't possibly have had a meeting like this. It was inconceivable. Now you can have it. It's an indication of a lot of things that have happened. And if we think about the past and the present, still a long way to go. Thanks.